Deep in the heart of Montana's vast pine forests, where the golden hues of autumn bled into the encroaching chill of winter, a lone figure stood at the edge of a clearing. Buddy, a golden retriever with a thick, honey-colored coat, remained still unnaturally still. His ears pricked forward, his amber eyes locked onto something beyond the veil of trees. He did not bark, did not whimper. He only watched, tail lowered, body tense. Elena Carter exhaled, her breath turning to mist in the crisp morning air. She had seen Buddy in many moods, excited, playful, alert, but never like this. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, stepping closer. The dog didn't flinch. Elena followed his gaze, her pulse quickening. The forest ahead stretched endlessly, untouched and untamed. The wind stirred the branches, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine. And then, just for a fraction of a second, she saw it. A shadow, barely visible against the backdrop of towering trees. A sleek, spotted form, crouched low, its sharp, piercing gaze meeting hers before vanishing into the wilderness. Her breath caught in her throat. Jessie. A name whispered in the recesses of her memory. A name that carried with it a story of impossible friendship, of survival against all odds. And just like that, the world around her melted away, drawing her 2 years back to the very moment it had all begun. 2 years earlier. It was the kind of autumn afternoon that made everything feel alive, the air crisp, the sky a brilliant stretch of blue. The sprawling land behind Elena's cabin was bathed in golden light, the trees a riot of red, orange, and yellow. Buddy had been outside for nearly an hour, chasing leaves, digging at the earth, and sniffing at every stray scent the wind carried his way. Elena, watching from the porch with a steaming mug of coffee, smiled as he darted through the fenced yard, a blur of unfiltered joy. Then silence. The kind of silence that settled like a heavy weight, pressing against the natural hum of the forest. Elena straightened, the warmth of her coffee momentarily forgotten. "Buddy?" she called, stepping off the porch. No response. Her stomach clenched. Buddy never ignored her. Setting her mug down, she hurried across the yard, her boots crunching against the fallen leaves. As she reached the fence, she noticed it, a small, freshly dug hole near the base. Just big enough for a determined dog to squeeze through. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," she muttered. Grabbing a flashlight and slipping through the gate, Elena followed the faint trail of paw prints leading toward the tree line. The forest, though beautiful, felt unnervingly vast as she ventured deeper. Then she heard it. A soft whimper. Her breath hitched. She quickened her pace, weaving through the underbrush until she spotted movement ahead. And there, just beyond the clearing, was Buddy. He was crouched low, tail wagging slightly, his nose nudging at something small and fragile curled against the base of an old pine tree. Elena's heart pounded as she took another step closer, her eyes widening at the sight before her. A tiny bobcat cub. It was impossibly small, its fur matted, its ribs visible beneath its thin coat. Its ears twitched weakly, and when it let out another feeble whimper, it sounded more like a plea than a cry. Elena froze. This wasn't right. Bobcat cubs didn't wander alone, not at this age. She swallowed hard, instinct warring with reason. She wasn't a rescuer. She wasn't a biologist. She was a photographer, a storyteller. But as she looked from the trembling cub to Buddy, who stood protectively beside it, something inside her shifted. Whatever had happened to this creature, whatever had left it alone in the world, one thing was certain. It wouldn't survive the night out here. And just like that, everything changed. Elena Carter had never considered herself a savior. She was a photographer, a storyteller who captured the raw beauty of the wild, but she had always remained an observer, never an intruder. Born and raised in Montana, she had spent most of her life in the shadow of its vast forests, drawn to their untamed mystery. Her home, A rustic cabin on the edge of protected land was both a sanctuary and a studio. It was here that she built a career documenting wildlife, using her lens to bring the unseen world into focus. She preferred solitude, the quiet rhythm of nature, the unspoken connection she shared with the land. The only constant companion in her secluded life was Buddy, a golden retriever with boundless energy and a heart too big for his own good. He had been with her since he was a tiny ball of fur, tripping over his own oversized paws. Now at 2 years old, he had grown into a powerful yet gentle creature, his golden coat gleaming like late summer wheat. He was everything Elena wasn't: warm, trusting, eager to connect. While she watched the world through a camera lens, Buddy dove headfirst into it, unafraid, unguarded. Buddy had a habit of following his instincts, a trait that often led him into trouble. He chased scents with relentless curiosity, found joy in every rustling leaf, and had a way of sensing things Elena couldn't. He wasn't just a pet, he was a bridge between her world and the wild, a reminder that life wasn't meant to be lived at a distance. When he discovered the bobcat cub, he hadn't hesitated. He had dug his way under the fence, crossed the invisible boundary between domestic and wild, and placed himself between a helpless creature and the cruel indifference of nature. The cub, barely clinging to life, was a contradiction of instincts. It should have been afraid, defensive, its small frame coiled with the remnants of its predatory nature. Instead, it had let Buddy approach, let him press his nose against its fur, let him stay. Something about the dog's presence had kept it calm, or perhaps it was simply too weak to resist. Elena had seen many things through her lens: moments of survival, brutality, grace, but nothing quite like this. As she crouched beside them that evening, feeling the weight of the choice before her, she knew she was stepping into something irreversible. She was no stranger to the rules of the wild. Predators did not befriend prey, and nature did not grant mercy. Yet here was Buddy, defying the laws written into his very instincts, offering protection to a creature that should have been his adversary. And here she was, faced with a decision that would challenge everything she thought she knew. She didn't know then that this moment, this single act of defiance against the natural order, would alter the course of all their lives. She only knew that she couldn't walk away. Elena didn't hesitate. She reached for Buddy's collar, steadying him as she took in the fragile creature before her. The bobcat cub barely moved, its breaths shallow, its tiny ribs rising and falling in uneven rhythm. It was smaller than it should have been for its age, malnourished, weak. A mother would never leave her young behind unless something had gone terribly wrong. Elena had spent enough time in the wild to know what this meant. The cub was alone. If she left it here, it wouldn't last the night. Cold would seep into its bones. Hunger would gnaw away what little strength remained. And by morning, it would be nothing more than another lost thing swallowed by the wilderness. But this wasn't as simple as scooping it up and bringing it home. Wild animals weren't meant to be pets. Every instinct screamed at her to leave it, to let nature take its course. Yet, when she looked at Buddy, saw the unwavering way he stood guard over the cub, she knew she had already made her decision. She pulled off her jacket, moving slowly, carefully, wrapping the tiny body in the thick fabric. The cub flinched but didn't fight her. Too weak to resist, too far gone to care. Its fur was coarse beneath her fingers, its heartbeat rapid, a frantic rhythm against the hollow of its chest. Buddy pressed his nose to the bundle in her arms and let out a soft whine. "All right," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "Let's get you inside." The walk back to the cabin was tense, every step carrying the weight of uncertainty. This was a bad idea. She wasn't equipped for this. She had no experience raising wild animals, no way of knowing if the cub would even make it through the night. She should call someone, let the professionals handle it. But as she stepped through the door, kicking it shut behind her, she knew there was no turning back. Inside, she moved quickly, setting the cub down on a thick towel near the fireplace. She grabbed her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for: Dr. Mason. A wildlife specialist, one of the best in the state. If anyone could tell her what to do, it was him. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Carter?" His voice was rough, edged with exhaustion. "It's late. I know. I need your help." She wasted no time explaining, her words tumbling out too fast, too desperate. "It's a bobcat cub. Looks about 4 months old. It's starving, probably abandoned. I don't think it's injured, but it's not in good shape." Silence. Then, a sharp exhale. "You didn't bring it inside, did you?" Elena glanced at the cub, at Buddy curled protectively beside it. "Not exactly." "Damn it, Carter." A pause. "Listen to me. You're not trained for this. That cub needs professional care, not a makeshift bed in your cabin." "I know," she admitted. "But it wouldn't have survived out there. I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice." He sighed, resigned. "All right. Keep it warm, but not too hot. No food yet, just water if it'll take it. I'll be there in the morning." Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The hard part hadn't even begun. She ended the call and turned her attention back to the cub. Its eyes were half-lidded, barely conscious. Too weak to be afraid, to fight, to do anything but exist in this fragile, uncertain state. Buddy nosed at its side, his body curled around it like a shield. His warmth, his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was the only comfort the cub had known in what must have been days of fear and solitude. Hours passed in a restless blur. Elena stayed close, watching, waiting, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire. The cub stirred once, shifting slightly in its bundle of warmth, but never fully woke. She wondered if it even knew where it was, if it sensed the danger had passed, if it felt safe. Sleep didn't come for her, not really. She dozed in and out, every sound snapping her back to wakefulness. By dawn, exhaustion pressed heavy against her bones, but she refused to leave the cub's side. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Buddy remained in place, unwavering in his silent vigil. Then a sound. Faint, barely there. A tiny, almost imperceptible rumble. Elena stiffened, barely daring to breathe. It was purring. The realization hit her harder than she expected. Bobcats weren't domestic animals. They didn't purr like house cats. But this one, this tiny, battered survivor, was pressed against Buddy's side, its frail body rising and falling in time with his. It was weak, vulnerable, but alive. And for the first time since she had found it, Elena allowed herself to hope. The morning arrived in slow, muted shades of gray. Elena sat on the floor beside the cub, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, but she didn't move. The small body in the bundle of blankets remained still, its breathing steady but shallow. Buddy hadn't left its side, his head resting on his paws, watching over the fragile creature like a silent guardian. When the sound of tires crunching against gravel broke the quiet, Elena exhaled in relief. She rose, stretching the stiffness from her limbs before making her way to the door. Dr. Mason stood on the porch, his sharp blue eyes scanning her with the kind of look that spoke of both disapproval and resignation. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting him in. He crouched beside the cub, his hands moving with practiced precision, checking its limbs, feeling for fractures, lifting its eyelids to examine its response. Buddy let out a low whine, shifting closer as if to protest the intrusion. Mason shot the dog a glance but didn't push him away. "Malnourished, dehydrated," he muttered. "No serious injuries, but it's weak. Probably lost its mother days ago. It shouldn't be alive." His words hit Elena harder than she expected. She had known, of course, but hearing it confirmed by an expert, made it feel heavier. "Can it recover?" she asked, crossing her arms. Mason sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "With the right care, yes. But this isn't a house cat, Carter. You can't just keep it." "I know that," she shot back, a little too quickly. She glanced at Buddy, at the way he stayed close, his eyes never leaving the cub. "I need to see it through." Mason studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Fine. We'll do this properly. Strict schedule, strict diet. No unnecessary contact. The goal is rehabilitation, not domestication." Elena nodded, though a part of her already knew this was going to be more complicated than either of them expected. The next few weeks were a delicate balance of care and restraint. Mason provided instructions, detailed feeding schedules, hydration protocols, and constant reminders that the cub needed to retain its wild instincts. Elena followed every rule to the letter. She kept her distance, fed the cub the prescribed diet, and limited her interactions to what was necessary for its survival. But Buddy was another matter entirely. No one had accounted for him, for the silent understanding that had formed between him and the cub. He would sit beside its crate, lying close without crossing any invisible boundaries. When the cub ate, Buddy remained still, watching but never interfering. When it slept, he curled nearby, his presence a quiet reassurance. And when it stirred in the night, letting out soft broken sounds, Buddy was the one it turned to. The cub, now named Jessie, gained strength faster than expected. What had once been a trembling, fragile creature now moved with cautious purpose, its muscles growing lean, its coat regaining its natural luster. It learned quickly, its wild instincts sharpening. But even as it grew more independent, one thing never changed. It never strayed far from Buddy. Days turned into weeks, and Jessie's transformation was undeniable. Her once fragile body had filled out with lean muscle. Her coat had lost its dull, patchy texture, and her movements had grown sharper, more precise. She no longer stumbled when she walked, but instead prowled, her instincts awakening with each passing day. Mason visited regularly, monitoring her progress with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many rescues fail. "She's almost ready for the next step," he said one afternoon, watching as Jessie batted at a makeshift toy Elena had crafted, a bundle of feathers tied to a string. The cub's reaction was swift and controlled, a predator honing its skills. But the real test came when she was introduced to moving prey. Mason set up a controlled environment in the garage, releasing a live mouse into the enclosure. Jessie hesitated at first, her muscles coiling as she tracked its movements, but then instinct took over. She pounced with precision, her claws sinking into her target with a confidence that made something in Elena tighten. "She's learning," Mason murmured. "That's good." But was it? Elena had spent every day preparing for this moment, yet watching Jessie embrace her wild nature made it painfully clear that their time together was running out. She was no longer the helpless cub Buddy had found beneath the trees. She was a hunter, a creature of the wild, and soon she would have to return to it. Buddy, however, didn't seem to understand. He still lay beside Jessie's enclosure at night, still watched her with the same quiet devotion he always had. Jessie, despite her growing independence, still responded to him in a way that defied logic. She would brush against the enclosure's mesh, pressing close as if seeking comfort, and Buddy would rest his nose against it in return. It was a bond that neither of them seemed willing to break. One evening, Elena found herself standing by the enclosure longer than usual, watching Jessie move in the dim light. The cub's golden eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, before shifting back to Buddy, as if torn between two worlds. The wild was calling, but something held her back. "You have to let her go," Mason had warned. But as Elena looked at Buddy, at the quiet understanding in his eyes, she wondered if it would really be that simple. Jessie was recovering, stronger than ever, but there was one thing no one had accounted for. What would happen when the time finally came to say goodbye? The inevitability of Jesse's release hung over the cabin like an unspoken truth, growing heavier with each passing day. Mason was clear she was ready. Her instincts were sharp, her reaction swift, her body lean and powerful. She no longer hesitated when given a live target, no longer looked to Buddy for reassurance the way she once had. She was, by every measure, a wild animal now. But despite all the signs, despite knowing this was always the plan, Elena felt the weight of something deeper, something unspoken, that neither she nor Buddy could fully understand. Buddy knew something was changing. He had always been intuitive, sensing Elena's moods before she spoke, responding to Jesse's presence with a patience that defied logic. But lately, he had grown restless. He would pace near Jesse's enclosure, his movements uncertain, his ears twitching at the faintest sound from within. Jessie, too, had begun behaving differently. Where once she had eagerly approached the mesh, pressing close to Buddy's side, now she paced. Restless, unsettled, watching the trees beyond the cabin with something unreadable in her golden eyes. Mason arrived one evening, carrying the final documents that would clear Jesse's transition to the rehabilitation sanctuary. "We can move her next week," he said, setting the papers down on the wooden table with finality. "It's time." Elena nodded but said nothing. Across the room, Buddy lifted his head from his resting spot near Jesse's enclosure, ears pricking forward at the tension in the air. Jessie, curled in the corner of her space, watched the exchange with the stillness of a predator waiting for something unseen. Later that night, long after Mason had left, Elena sat by the window, staring out at the darkened forest. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. She knew Mason was right. Jesse belonged out there, not in a garage, not in the quiet, controlled environment they had built for her. But knowing didn't make it easier. Buddy stirred at her feet, lifting his head to look at her before glancing toward Jesse's enclosure, as if he too was waiting for something. Elena sighed, pushing herself up from the chair. "Come on, let's check on her." She opened the door to the garage, the cool night air pressing against her skin. Jessie was awake, standing near the mesh, her body tense in the dim light. Something was different. There was an energy in the air, an anticipation that made Elena hesitate. Buddy padded forward, his tail low, his gaze locked on Jessie. The Bobcat didn't move at first, just watched him, her ears flicking back slightly. Then, in a movement so fast Elena barely saw it, Jessie lunged not at her, but at the mesh itself. The force of it rattled the enclosure, the sound echoing in the quiet. Elena froze. Jessie had never done that before. Buddy, startled, took a step back, his eyes wide, his body stiff. Jessie didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth. She just stared, muscles coiled, every part of her radiating something Elena had spent weeks pretending wasn't there. A need, a drive, something primal and undeniable. Freedom. It wasn't anger, wasn't aggression, it was instinct. Jessie had spent months regaining her strength, relearning what it meant to survive, and now, she had reached the point where nothing could hold her back. Elena's chest tightened. She swallowed hard, gripping the wooden frame of the enclosure. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know." Buddy let out a soft whine, stepping closer again, but this time, Jessie didn't press against the mesh. She simply watched him, her gaze lingering before she turned away, retreating to the far end of the enclosure. For the first time since that fateful day Buddy had found her, she had made her choice. And it wasn't him. Elena exhaled shakily, forcing herself to accept what she had always known. Jessie wasn't staying. She never had been. And no matter how much Buddy loved her, no matter how much Jessie may have once relied on him, the wild had already claimed her. The release wasn't next week. It was now. Elena moved without thinking, her pulse thrumming in her ears as she unlatched the enclosure door. The night pressed against the garage walls, thick and heavy, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Jessie didn't move at first. She stood still, her golden eyes fixed on Elena, her body a coiled spring, waiting. Buddy shifted beside her, his tail low, his head tilted as if trying to understand what was happening. He had spent months guarding Jessie, protecting her, and now Elena was opening the door between them, breaking the only barrier that had ever existed. A gust of wind rushed through the open door, sweeping in the scent of the forest, carrying something primal with it. Jessie's ears flicked. Her muscles tensed. She hesitated only a second longer before she stepped forward, moving past Elena with the grace of something that had never truly belonged in captivity. She didn't bolt, didn't run wildly into the unknown. She moved with purpose, a creature answering a call that had been inside her all along. Buddy took a step forward as if to follow, but Elena reached out, resting a hand gently against his back. "No," she murmured, her voice barely more than breath. "She has to go." Buddy let out a soft whine, ears twitching, but he didn't fight her. He only watched as Jessie crossed the threshold into the night, her sleek form melting into the shadows of the trees. For a moment, she was nothing more than a whisper against the darkness, a presence barely there. Then she turned. Just once. Her gaze met Buddy's, something ancient and unreadable passing between them. Then, without a sound, she was gone. Silence stretched between them. The forest had swallowed her whole, as if she had never been there at all. Elena exhaled, her chest tight, her heart aching in a way she hadn't expected. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it, but it still felt like something had been torn away. Buddy stood motionless beside her, his eyes still locked on the spot where Jessie had vanished, his breathing slow and steady. Then, after what felt like forever, he sat down. Not in defeat, not in sadness, just in understanding. Elena reached down, running her fingers through his fur. "She'd be okay," she whispered, but she wasn't sure if she was saying it for him or for herself. Buddy let out a slow breath, then finally turned away from the trees. He didn't look back. Neither did she. Weeks passed, and the forest felt different without Jessie. The house was quieter, the routine unchanged yet somehow altered. Buddy still lingered near the edge of the tree some mornings, ears perked as if listening for a sound only he could hear. But Jessie was gone, and life moved forward in the way it always did. Mason checked in occasionally, reassuring Elena that Jessie had a good chance of survival. She was strong when she left, he reminded her. She knew how to hunt, how to fend for herself. That's all we can hope for. Elena nodded, but part of her still wondered, still listened in the quiet moments, hoping for something she knew she wouldn't find. Then one morning, something changed. Buddy was restless, pacing near the back porch, his tail wagging in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He wasn't anxious, wasn't upset. He was waiting. Elena followed his gaze toward the tree line, her pulse quickening. The forest stood as it always had, vast and unmoving, but something was there, something just out of sight. A flicker of movement between the trees. A shape she had convinced herself she wouldn't see again. Jessie. She wasn't close, wasn't approaching. She stood at a distance, her sleek body half hidden in the shadows, her golden eyes watching with that same unreadable intensity. She had changed, her frame was leaner, her coat fuller, the wildness in her more pronounced than ever. She was no longer a creature caught between two worlds. She was part of the forest now, part of something untamed, something that had always belonged to her. Buddy didn't bark, didn't move. He simply watched, his tail wagging slowly, a quiet acknowledgement of something deeper than instinct. Jessie held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned, slipping back into the wilderness without hesitation. This time, there was no sadness in the way she left. No hesitation. No lingering doubt. Elena exhaled, something in her chest loosening. Jessie had made her choice, but she had come back not to stay, not to be reclaimed, but as if to say she was okay. That she had survived. That the bond they had shared had not disappeared, only changed, evolved into something no longer needed to be held onto. That night, as Elena sat on the porch with Buddy resting at her feet, she thought about the months that had led them here, about the impossible friendship that had formed between a dog and a predator, about the lesson that had been waiting for her all along. Love wasn't about holding on. It wasn't about keeping something safe in a place it didn't belong. It was about knowing when to let go, when to trust that what you've given is enough. Buddy let out a slow breath, his body relaxing, his golden fur illuminated by the fading light. He understood, just as she did. Jessie was where she was meant to be. And that was enough.